In the garden behind her father's house in Domrémy, a girl of 13 stood still at midday, the sun directly overhead, when a light broke across her right side, brighter than daylight, arriving from nowhere, followed by a voice. She did not scream. She did not run to tell her mother. She listened. The voice told her to be good, to attend Mass, to keep faith. And then it was gone, and the garden was only a garden again, the chickens scratching in the dirt as though nothing had happened. She told no one. 4 years later, that same girl, unable to read her own name, having never traveled beyond a half-day's walk from her village, would kneel before the disinherited heir to the throne of France and tell him that God had sent her to save his kingdom. He would believe her enough to give her an army. This is the account of how an illiterate farm girl became impossible to refuse. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. By the time Joan was born, France had been at war with England for the better part of a century, a conflict that history would later name for its staggering duration, the 100 Years' War. In 1420, when she was a small child, the Treaty of Troyes handed the future of the French crown to the English line. Charles VI of France, intermittently incapacitated by mental illness, recognized the English King Henry V as his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles. When Henry V and Charles VI both died within 2 months of each other in 1422, an infant, Henry VI of England, was proclaimed King of France in Paris, while the disinherited Dauphin, not yet crowned, presided over a fractured and impoverished court south of the Loire River. France itself was split between Armagnac loyalists who supported the Dauphin and Burgundians allied with England, the Duchy of Burgundy controlling much of the north and east. Domrémy sat on a narrow finger of loyalist territory inside otherwise hostile country, a village whose allegiance made it a target rather than a sanctuary. By October 1428, English forces had laid siege to Orléans, the last significant obstacle protecting what remained of the Dauphin's kingdom. By most measures available to the people living through it, France was losing. Joan was born around 1412. In a peasant village of this period, exact birth years were rarely recorded, and ages were estimated rather than fixed. Scholars rely on her own later testimony that she believed herself to be about 19 in 1431, a phrase that in practice likely meant somewhere between 17 and 21. She was born in Domrémy, a village of perhaps 200 people straddling the border between the duchies of Bar and Lorraine. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, farmed land and held minor standing in village affairs. Her mother, Isabelle, called Romée after a pilgrimage she had once made, raised 5 children in a household that was poor but not destitute. Joan herself never used the surname history would attach to her. At her trial, she called herself simply Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maid. Of her early years, what survives comes almost entirely from her own mouth, recorded under hostile interrogation when she was a prisoner fighting for her life, a fact worth holding on to throughout everything that follows. She told her judges she had learned her faith from her mother, not from any priest, and that she had been taught to sow and spin rather than herd sheep, contrary to the pastoral image later generations would attach to her. She said other children teased her for how often she prayed. She loved the sound of the church bells, and at around the age of 13, in her father's garden, she heard a voice for the first time. It came, she said, from her right side, accompanied by a brightness she struggled to put into words. It told her to be good, to go to church often. She was afraid. The voice returned, and over time she came to believe it belonged to the Archangel Michael. Later joined, she testified, by Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, two virgin martyrs whose painted images would have been familiar to her from the walls of her parish church. The voices, she said, wept when they described the suffering of France. They told her she would have to leave her village. They told her she would lead the Dauphin to be crowned. They told her this for years before she acted on any of it. By her own account, she resisted at first, insisting she was only a poor girl who could not ride a horse or lead men into battle. The voices did not relent. The political crisis sharpened her conviction. As the English noose tightened around Orléans through the autumn of 1428, Domrémy itself was not spared the violence of a divided country. The village had already been raided by Burgundian forces during Joan's childhood, forcing its people to flee temporarily to the fortified town of Neufchâteau. War, for Joan, was not an abstraction relayed by traveling merchants. It came to her door. In May 1428, not yet 17, she traveled to nearby Vaucouleurs, the closest stronghold still loyal to the Dauphin, and asked its captain, Robert de Baudricourt, for an armed escort to the royal court. Baudricourt, unimpressed, told the relative who had brought her to take her home and have her father give her a beating for her trouble. She returned to Domrémy, but she did not stop. And in January 1429, she came back to Vaucouleurs a second time. This time, something had shifted. According to testimony gathered decades later from witnesses present in the town, Joan announced, before any official word had arrived, that the Dauphin's forces had suffered a defeat near Orléans. Days afterward, news confirmed it. A French force attempting to intercept an English supply convoy of herring and other provisions had been routed, an engagement that would come to be known with a certain dark humor as the Battle of the Herrings. Whether Joan possessed some advanced knowledge through a channel now lost to history, or whether the story was elaborated in later retelling to magnify her credibility, cannot be settled with certainty. Some historians treat the anecdote with real skepticism, noting that Baudricourt may simply have run out of better options. The military situation was dire, and Joan had by then gathered enough of a following among the townspeople of Vaucouleurs that ignoring her further had become its own kind of risk. Whatever combination of conviction, pressure, and desperation moved him, Baudricourt's resistance broke. He granted her an armed escort. She cut her hair short, the rough crop of a soldier, and put on men's clothing provided for the trip, a practical decision she would later explain, meant to protect her honor while traveling among armed men through contested country, though it would become one of the central charges against her at trial 2 years afterward. Her escort included 2 minor noblemen, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, both of whom would testify on her behalf decades after her death, describing a young woman of unshakable calm despite the danger of the road. The distance to Chinon, where the Dauphin's court resided, exceeded 300 miles of winter-hardened country thick with English and Burgundian patrols, any one of which could have ended her cause before it began. They rode for roughly 11 days, mostly under cover of night, fording rivers swollen and freezing with the season's melt rather than risk the bridges and towns where they might be stopped, or worse. She arrived at Chinon in late February or early March of 1429. The Dauphin, wary of fraud, pretenders and visionaries were not uncommon in a kingdom desperate for any sign of divine favor, arranged a test. He disguised himself among his courtiers and placed another man on the throne in his place. Joan, according to testimony later collected from multiple witnesses present, walked past the false king without hesitation and identified Charles correctly within the crowd. What she said to him afterward, in a private conversation that reportedly addressed his own private doubts about his legitimacy, was never recorded by anyone in the room, and no surviving contemporary document specifies its content, only that whatever passed between them was enough to keep her at court rather than send her away. Recognition was not enough, however, to grant her an army outright. For roughly 3 weeks in March 1429, a panel of theologians and clergy at Poitiers examined her, questioning her faith, her claims, and the nature of her voices, searching for any sign of heresy or deception. The original record of their findings, known to history as the Poitiers Conclusions, has since been lost, surviving only in references made by later documents. Separately, a group of matrons under the direction of Yolande of Aragon, the Dauphin's mother-in-law, examined her physically to confirm her virginity. In an age that linked chastity to spiritual legitimacy, proof that she was not, as some accused, an instrument of darker forces. She passed both examinations. The court approved her request. A small force was assembled at the Dauphin's expense, and Joan, not yet 17 by some estimates, perhaps just past it by others, was permitted to accompany it. Ahead lay Orléans, besieged for 5 months and on the edge of falling. Ahead lay the test that would make her name. Most of what is known about Joan's early life comes from 2 trial records, separated by 20 years and opposite in purpose. The first, the trial of condemnation in 1431, preserved her own testimony, but it was extracted by judges determined to convict her, and her words survive only as filtered through hostile notaries, however meticulous their transcription. The second, the nullification trial of the 1450s, gathered testimony from those who had known her, family, neighbors, the men who escorted her to Chinon, but those memories were recorded decades after the events they described by witnesses with every motivation to rehabilitate a woman whose condemnation had embarrassed the crown that owed her its throne. Some popular details do not survive close scrutiny. The familiar image of Joan as a shepherdess tending flocks in open fields is largely a later Romantic invention. Her own testimony describes domestic labor, spinning and sewing, far more than pastoral work. Her birth year, commonly given as 1412, is an estimate derived from her own approximate self-reporting, not a documented record. The exact wording of whatever private confirmation she offered Charles VII at Chinon is unknown, and was never recorded by any contemporary witness. Later traditions supplied specific and dramatic content that cannot be verified by any surviving source. The claim that she predicted the Battle of the Herrings before news of it arrived rests on testimony collected long after the fact and should be understood as part of the traditional account rather than an independently confirmed fact. As for the voices themselves, modern historians and clinicians have proposed various naturalistic explanations, among them temporal lobe epilepsy, migraine with aura, and conditions on the schizophrenia spectrum, though none of these can be diagnosed retroactively with any confidence, and each remains a hypothesis rather than a demonstrated conclusion. The historical record establishes what Joan believed and what she accomplished. It does not adjudicate why. What endures in this part of Joan's story is not the war itself, but the improbability of her being heard at all. She held no title, no education, no claim to influence beyond her own certainty, and that certainty was enough to move a captain to grant her an escort, a future king to grant her an audience, and a panel of trained theologians to grant her their approval. Every gatekeeper she met had reason to dismiss her and chose instead to let her pass. Historians can trace the political desperation that made the Dauphin's court receptive to any source of legitimacy, however unlikely its origin. What they cannot fully explain is the force of will in a teenage girl that made the unlikely feel, to nearly everyone she encountered, like something closer to certainty. Whether that force came from conviction, from circumstance, or from somewhere she alone could name, is a question the record leaves open. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.